I am Joao Vendramini, and I'm a former professor at the University of Florida at the Range Cattle Research and Education Center, and I'm current a professor at Texas A&M University in Stephenville, Texas. And today, the title of the webinar will be the feed value of all fertilized forage in Florida. And this title may be a little misleading because I really focus on South Florida more than the whole state of Florida. So it's a work that we have been doing. We are doing the second year now, and that is the master's work from Olivia. She and the forage group at ONA are the ones that are really working on that project. So we have several collaborators that have been instrumental in getting us moving with the project. You're going to see Hannah Baker, the economist at the research center. He has been the one because he has a lot of economic appeal in this project. So she's very important in this effort. And also Dr. Muriel and Dr. Walau that also have been collaborating in the project. Like I mentioned, I will focus a lot in South Florida, and we primarily in South Florida, we live on warm season perennial grasses. And differently from the northern parts of Florida or even the whole southeastern, we have very little opportunity to have cool season forages for our winter and even in the fall. With that in mind, most of the efforts has been focused on producing forage during the times of the year where most of these warm season forages are dormant. So we used to say that in South Florida, the cool season forage for us, it's a warm season forage called limpo grass because it's the one that grows the best during those winter months. So we do have a little variety of species that we commonly use, and Bahia grass is the one that everybody has. And then we have the secondary ones that for us, limpo grass is probably the second most important, but we also have Bermuda grass, and we have still star grass that is not probably as popular as it was in the past, but we still have star grass in South Florida. And finally, we have some other warm season perennial species that we have been testing for a while in South Florida, and they have shown to be productive, and some of them has very good nutritive value, such as the brachiaria and the Guinea grass. And one particular thing about all these warm season grasses is when the day length gets shorter, temperature get temperature doesn't change a lot in South Florida, I know, but it gets a little cooler. Some of these grasses has the dormancy trigger, right? And makes them to stop growing pretty much during that region. Rainfall is quite variable. We rely on that a lot to have more forage in the fall and winter. But it's also a very important component. But even if we have adequate rainfall, you're going to see that a lot of these grasses, they stop growing during the fall months and then during the winter. And what happened is we ended up with these very contrasting scenarios where we see sometimes during the summer we have too much grass, and sometimes during the fall and winter we have very little grass that will really limit animal performance, right? And that is our main goal, try to provide sufficient forage, and then those animals can thrive during the whole year and do not have this high variation in the nutritional status, right? And I will go with some of the forages that we explore and for our trial. That is Bahia grass Argentine is the cultivar that is the most popular for us in South Florida. It is probably the one that is most planted and used, is very productive. I always tell people that you should have a very good reason to have some other species in South Florida than Argentine Bahia grass. And most of the areas that we graze are planted with Bahia grass for the reason that it's productive, is resilient, it thrives in low input systems. So that's why we like it. And then it's included in this effort. So Gibituck limpo grass is a hybrid limpo grass. Limpo grass is, as I mentioned before, is our winter forage. It's really good for poorly drained soils, places that we do have in South Florida a lot. And they have pretty much become our second most important because a lot of the properties will have some places that are too wet for Bahia grass. So then we plant the limpo grass. Very good to be used year long, but in the winter, it's a forage that we rely a lot because we stockpile and it has a little better growth. It's less day length sensitive than Bahia grass, for example. Gibituck was a hybrid that the University of Florida we released in 2014 and probably has been, as a lot of producers tell me, the best cultivar of warm season perennial grass that probably the University of Florida have ever released. And then on the side, we have those two other species. Bermuda grass, it's very popular in the whole southeastern US, but not very popular in South Florida. In 2001, we released a cultivar called Miss Levy Bermuda grass. We like the Miss Levy because also it's not very sensitive to day length. And it's the Bermuda grass cultivar that grows better in early spring and late in the fall. So that fits well in this effort to try to have that test of fall fertilization. And it's a grass that probably requires more inputs and more care. So, but it has been probably a very good grass for us in South Florida when you think about mainly conserved forage such as hay and silage. And the last one that I will mention is a hybrid Bahia grass. We have been a hybrid brachiaria grass that we have been working with this hybrid since they were released in Colombia in 2000 and probably 4 or 5. Brachiarias are the most planted genus in all tropical and subtropical areas in the world. So it's widely used in several countries, but it has very limited use for us in Florida because sometimes it gets too cold. Not in South Florida. South Florida is perennial, it grows well, but they have a breeding program in Colombia where they release several different hybrids and they all look different. So I have been trying some different ones. And about 6-7 years ago, I got the Camelo. There was one that had the appeal that you will tolerate better drought weather. And we brought to Florida, but I really like the architecture of the plant because it's a little shorter than the others, easier to manage. It produces a lot of seed and it has excellent nutritive value. So with that, I add that to the effort for us to test. So, and with that, we select those species and the fertilization management seems to be natural because it is probably the most costly input that we have in this grass production. With that, the producers call me in the fall to ask me when is too late to fertilize. And that question keeps coming back year after year. In my 20 years at the University of Florida, I probably got phone calls, multiple phone calls, always in the fall asking the same question. And with that in mind, we decided to set up this trial that was aligned with the Florida Cattlemen's interest and was funded by the Florida Cattle Enhancement Board. And so the general objective was to have these different species fertilized at different times in the fall, starting August and going up to October, and mainly to assess what will be the value of that grass that we produce during those years, we know that the production will be not as good as in the summer. So when you, or even in the spring, but therefore, even if those species doesn't produce as much, the value of that forage at that time of the year when forage production is limited, it may be greater than just a particular forage production during the summer, for example. So this trial, the data that I will present, this trial, as I mentioned, is 2004-2005 trial. So we are repeating again this year. And the treatments were the split plot arrangement for species, as I mentioned, and we fertilized those in August, September, or October, okay? Different areas, right? You have one area that fertilized in August, one in September, one in October. And you harvest those 8 weeks after we fertilize. So 8 weeks after we fertilize, we come and harvest the forage. The fertilization that we use is about 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and we use a 20-5-20 complete blend because in this case, we are harvesting. Probably if you would be grazing, you wouldn't be so essential to do NP and K for that time of the year, but we do NP and K, and we try to supply during the fall these 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we select 50, could be 60 or 70. It depends on the producer interest. We know on the nitrogen management, you put a little more nitrogen, you get a little more production up to the point when you start going over the 70, 80 pounds, the efficiency of conversion between nitrogen and forage start decreasing. So we believe that we limited that to 50 pounds just to make it more practical and something that the producers in South Florida use more frequently. Okay, so we're gonna switch to results now, and probably the production is the one that people are more interested. It has much more to that than production, but we will focus on the production here. And you can see when we fertilize in August, you're gonna see that there was no difference between Bahia grass, limpo grass, and brachiaria grass in that 8 weeks. This is dry matter, okay? So it's a pretty good production for that 8 weeks. Accumulation is great. You're gonna see like we are not really sure what happened to the Bermuda grass. That's supposed to be really comparable to the other species. So we still don't have an answer. So the second year probably will give us some answers. But you can see here, Bahia grass, limpo grass, and brachiaria grass, they have the same production when we fertilize in August. So when you go from August to October, you see there is a really sharp decline in herbage accumulation, primarily because of the environmental conditions that I told you, mainly day length. And you're gonna see here, when we fertilize in September, so then Bahia, Bermuda, and limpo had the same herbage accumulation, right? Production was the same. But look at the brachiaria grass, how the production was bumped up, actually increased from August to September. So we know those really tropical grasses, they are the less sensitive to day length many times. That's why they are not persistent in many occasions in Florida, because they keep growing year long, and then the animals keep grazing, and then you may face a situation where the grass pretty much kill itself. But look at that fall accumulation from the brachiaria grass compared to the other grasses that almost double. And the last fertilization, I mean, more, right? October will be perceived as too late to fertilize, but we still have herbage accumulation on this brachiaria grass that is quite impressive, right? Whereas the other species really decline accumulation. So limpo grass, as we know, it's still after the brachiaria in this trial was still one that have a pretty good, greater than Bahia grass and Bermuda grass. So limpo grass is the one. If you have if you have to make a decision and do a fertilization and you have a Bahia grass, Bermuda grass, and limpo grass, and need to apply the nitrogen, for sure you'll be on the limpo grass that you need to invest the money. But we found out here that we have very little information in the literature that brachiaria grass is really excel in these subtropical areas, even when you do this later fertilization. And the other factor that is quite important in this whole equation is the digestibility, right? We don't want just to produce dry matter, we want to produce something that is digestible, that the animals will convert that in animal performance. And you can see the digestibility have a different pattern, mainly because when the forage grows more, it accumulates more cell wall that is less digestible, and some components of the cell wall make that less digestible. But like in August, you have greater production, but you have less digestibility, and vice versa, right? When we fertilize in October, you have less production, but you have greater digestibility. And quantity always drives the boat. It doesn't matter what is the quality if you don't have a quantity, right? You need to focus on the quantity standpoint. But here you can see how that decline. And again, something that we have noticed, the limpo grass here in the fall still have a very good digestibility, like when it's 8 weeks after we fertilize in October. So this harvest was about December, and we end up with a 60% digestibility that is outstanding for a warm season perennial grass. And this brachiaria, it's again very impressive because it keeps that really high digestibility throughout all the fall fertilization times. So even getting when the accumulation was the least in October, it has the greatest digestibility, going to 69% digestibility. That is just outstanding. We knew about digestibility of brachiarias from previous work that we have done. Is really, and that's why I think it becomes really attractive to us, mainly to focus on the digestibility of this forage that is, compared to the other forages, is quite outstanding. And then now I would like you to stop and pay attention to I will try to explain to you, and then I think for the next version of these results, when you have the 2 years, I think we're going to have a more elaborated economic analysis. But for this exercise, I will explain to you what I did. I estimated that you'll be about 10 cents per pound of digestible material. How we calculate digestible material per hectare, right? You just multiply the production by digestibility, and you have the amount of digestible material that you produce per acre in this case, okay? But how we got to that 10 cents, right? I made a decision, instead of comparing to corn or molasses or something that is a concentrate feed, I try to assess the price of a corn silage, because it will be a little more comparable because it has a greater fiber concentration, although it's something with very high digestibility. So if you go to the market and you have a ton of corn silage, there will be 35% dry matter, 70% digestibility, and they are charging around $90 a ton. It varies from 90 to 120, depends where you are in the country, but I got the least value here is $90 a ton. If you multiply that, so you'll be about 10 cents per pound of digestible dry matter in that corn silage. And I just use that number to calculate what will be the production per acre that we're gonna get from that fall fertilization. And then those are the numbers. As you can see, all the data that I show you, it translates in this graph. That is pretty much a combination of the production and the digestibility. You can see in August, we had a lot of production, but very little digestibility, right? So then we produce not a lot of digestible material, and then you have limited value. But we need the quantity, as I mentioned to you, but comparing the treatments, you're going to see the brachiaria was the best, mainly because it has the same production, but it has greater digestibility than the other forages. And you can see there The Bermuda grass had limited production and the nutritive value was quite comparable. So then it becomes the least interesting treatment for us. But then we go to September, October, and you ended up knowing that that brachiaria was again highly superior than the other treatments, followed by the limpogress. The limpogress was the second best treatment. And you can see you go in through the last date of fertilization, right? October 23rd, that we harvest this forage in December. Look the value of the digestible material produced in 1 acre of Bahia grass. It's like almost nothing. So if it's $20 that you produce in digestible material, you're going to spend more money with the nitrogen fertilization than what you're going to get out of it, right? So with that, that's the decision that you need to make, and that I think it probably concur with our previous thoughts that if you have some Bahia grass and some Bermuda grass, those are probably not the best ones to be fertilizing later in the fall. So we add some component to Olivia's work, that is the silage component, because many times the people that produce fall forage, they may decide to harvest as a hay or silage. We decide to do a silage work. But this one was just made with the harvest from September. The forage that we fertilized in September and we harvested that in November, we made the silage. So for this trial, you don't have the different fertilization times. You are more focused on the species, and then we did. We did a combination of species and inoculant, but I'll just show you the species difference, although we had some inoculant difference, but that will probably be presented in a different occasion. And I'll go with you on the mainly on the fermentation standpoint on that trial. And we know the warm season perennial grasses are probably not the most attractive forages to be in soil because problems in the fermentation. It has a low concentration water soluble carbohydrates, and it has, in general, greater than usual moisture concentration, right? And that will always lead to bad fermentation and bad preservation. However, we have been doing work with these forages now. That is like the general perception about the silage with these forages. And we have been doing silage with these forages for a while now, and we can see that you can have different outcomes. Species is a very important factor, and it depends what if you wilt, if you treat with an additive or something, you can have some different outcomes. In this case, I think it was a very good outcome on the fermentation standpoint, because you can see we didn't have difference in dry matter concentration between the forages, and this dry matter is below what we would think that is an ideal dry matter concentration for a silage fermentation, right? We used to shoot like for 35 on corn silage, and for these grasses, we may think that 50% dry matter will be the best to avoid the growth of Clostridium. But in this case here, I think we were below, but we still have, if you look at the pH, Gibituck gave us the lowest pH, and that's the most desirable thing. When you have low pH, you have less mold, less fungi, and less undesirable VFAs. And you can see Camelo was the highest pH and Gibituck was the lowest, meaning that that probably was the best to be ensiled. You can see on the other hand, on the crude protein standpoint, we know that this limpo grass may have a little less protein than other warm season perennial grasses. So Gibituck was a little lesser than Mislev and Camelo. But even with this lower pH, and that is a little intriguing, we have lower pH on Gibituck, but we have the same concentration of lactic acid. Lactic acid is the strongest one that make the pH drop, and the most desirable one in silage fermentation, and we had no difference in lactic acid. And we have a greater amount of acetic acid in the camelo. And, and that is very species specific. That happens because of some intrinsic things that they have in the composition of the ford that creates that different fermentation. I used to say people criticize if you have a corn silage, they think you need to have 5% lactic acid and no acetic acid. Acetic acid gives the silage that vinegar smell that is not the best. You want more that sweet smell. The acetic acid gives you that vinegar smell, and some people consider that a bad fermentation characteristic. But for us, in warm season perennial grass, if you have acetic acid, you are in good shape because that also preserves the forage, although it sometimes may be related to less intake. But we have differences, and Camelo was the one that produced the most. And then if you see the Mislev and Gibituck, there was no difference. And then the butyric acid, you see that the Mislev was the one with the greatest level of butyric, is still low, but butyric is the one that we don't want. Butyric and isobutyric is the one that creates that really bad smell and is related to Clostridium presence and bad fermentation. So you see Gibituck has the lowest, followed by Gibituck is supposed to be letter C there, that is missing, but we have the greatest in Mislev and intermediate in Camelo, but it's still lower levels of butyric, and Camelo had the highest level of isobutyric, with Gibituck having no isobutyric acid. So if you ask me if I need to preserve that as a silage, I always would lean towards to have limpo grass to be harvested as a silage, because we see that trend where the fermentation of limpo grass is usually better than the other warm season perennial grasses. And ammonia is the last one that also have that really bad smell that stick to you. So if you handle silage, that has bad fermentation and high levels of ammonia, like this Camelo will be with 16% ammonia, will be something that you can really smell. It's strong, offensive to odor. And then the Gibituck goes to 9%. That below 10, you can see it's something that gets a little mild, and also is related to intake. So again, certifying that this Gibituck is usually better when you think about the preservation as this fall fertilizer for the silage. So to wrap it up, the first year conclusions for the trial. If you have a Bahia grass pasture, you should not be spending your money in nitrogen fertilizer later than August. August is still something that is, you can get something out of it on the production standpoint, although digestibility may not be the best. It's still hot, it's still summer months, and then you may be using the nitrogen to grow a lot of cell wall that will not be very digestible. But if you need the quantity, that may be an option. Again, and there you always need to work with a supplementation program and try to match what you produce as a forage with the animal need, right? While limpo grass and brachiaria grass, they are more flexible. You're gonna have a better response if you, not a better response than if you fertilize in August, you're gonna have a better response than if you have Bahia grass and Bermuda grass, right? Comparing the species, if you have like a brachiaria grass, I think you can think about, you miss that fertilization window is late in October. I think it may be something that you may consider to produce more digestible dry matter on brachiaria, followed by limpo grass. But certainly for Bahia grass and Bermuda grass, I wouldn't think that will be a desirable thing to do. But one thing that we need to think about on these species, right, is how we are comparing here brachiaria and limpo grass, but they are completely different plants that grows in completely different places. So in the place where you have limpo grass, you will never have a Camelo brachiaria grass, right? You can have limpo grass in dry places like you have the brachiaria, but the limpo grass give us that flexibility to have forward in poorly drained places. Camelo, on the other hand, is very sensitive to poorly drained soils. So it's probably one of the most sensitive that I have seen so far. So if you have a place that you have water standing, the Camelo will die right away. So making those decisions, you need to probably, if you think the Camelo will give you that flexibility to the fall, but you need to find a place that is really well drained, such as those places that have been the old groves in South Florida, that has drainage system, they have the berms, they are dry, they have high fertility. That probably should be good places for the Camelo to grow. And also, when you produce that forage, regardless where you fertilize, like I mentioned, it's always good to match that with your animal needs. That Camelo, because of high digestibility, it has been really suitable to be grazed by animals with high nutrient requirements, such as heifers. You're gonna get better out of it. And then when you have a limpo grass, that it was still very good nutritive value, but it was a little below the Camelo, so you can graze with your mature cows or animals that has a little less nutrient requirement. And always thinking about you matching those with supplementation is always a good decision. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions that you might have. Thank you.
We have a question in the room. I'll take them on mic.
Okay.
Hello, Professor Vendramini. This is Joao Marques here. I wanted to know, do you think it is possible to replace Brachiaria camelo with other brachiarias because of the lack of tolerance that it has to water, to drought, to water? So, for example, Brachiaria humidicola.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is replacing the cultivar, right? Instead of using Camelo, that is one sensitive to water logging, probably use a Brachiaria humidicola that is less sensitive to water logging. And it's a trade-off because what happened is the humidicola will have a digestibility that will be quite similar to Bahia grass. And it doesn't grow as well in the fall as the Camelo, because humidicola is a different species, right? And so we had previous work with humidicola at ONA, and it behaves very similarly to Bahia grass, although it has a little greater production in the warmer months, and it is very sensitive to day length. So in this case, if you have to explore, you may have the option to explore different cultivars and different species of brachiaria, but I think the humidicola for this fall forage effort wouldn't be a good fit, primarily because the low nutritive value and the sensitivity to day length.
Anybody else have a question in the room? No? All right, Dr. Vendramini, that looks like that's all the questions, if there's still none in the chat. This is the information for our upcoming ONA highlight, and that's scheduled for July 8th. Cowboys and Scientists Translating Science into Conservation Action, with guest presenter Dr. Betsy Boughton, Program Director, Agroecology, Senior Research Biologist at Archibald Biological Station. And as I usually do, I will share the information on this with you in the link to the video for today, as well as the link so you can register if you might be interested in attending. The Winter Supplementation Seminar is going to be held August the 28th. It's an evening program from 6 to 8, and the cost to attend is $10. And that is being put on by the South Florida Beef Forage Program. And this event is going to be the first event in their UF Elite Herdsman Academy. This is going to be a program that is going to go through from August all the way to February, concluding here at the Research Center with a tour and a program here where those that complete this will receive certification. So all the information on that can be seen at the link here on the flyer. If you're not already doing so, we invite you to follow us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. And if you do not get our Friday e-news, we invite you to send us an email so that you can join that. And then every Friday, you'll receive something from us with news about what's happening here at the center and upcoming programs and other things that you might find interesting. So thank you again for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Vendramini, for being our guest speaker.
Thank you, Andrew.